The Death Star is still under construction in 2BBY. The first operational test, the vaporization of Alderaan, is 2 years away. What exists right now is scaffolding and ambition, a battle station being assembled in sections, too large for any hangar, built partly by Wookiee slave labor conscripted from across the Outer Rim. Inside it, in a corridor that will never make it into any Imperial briefing report, 3 people are running toward an escape point. Leia Organa, Mon Mothma, Bail Organa. They're alive because a young man absorbed everything Palpatine threw at him and didn't stop until they were clear. His name is Galen Marek. His family crest, the sigil of 2 Jedi Knights from Kashyyyk, is about to become the emblem of every organized resistance to Imperial rule that follows. Every X-Wing that launches at Yavin, every trooper who dies at Hoth, every vessel at Endor. The thread runs through him, through this room, through the decision he made in the last minutes of his life. He is somewhere between 17 and 22 years old. That's not a hedge for dramatic effect. It's the honest answer the record produces, and anything built on top of it needs to rest on accurate foundations. The TFU-specific Fandom wiki sets his birth at approximately 19 BBY. Wikipedia's main article describes him as born in the aftermath of the Clone Wars, which ended in 19 BBY, the younger end of the range. The Star Wars Legends Wiki and multiple fandom chronology reconstructions place his birth at approximately 24 BBY, producing an age around 22 at death. Community timeline reconstructions working from the prologue's visual evidence, Vader finds a small child on Kashyyyk in 19 BBY, clearly 3 to 5 years old, produce a death age of 17 to 21. The title says 19. That's the defensible midpoint of the cluster multiple independent sources converge toward. No single authoritative Legends sourcebook confirms that specific number, and no amount of editorial confidence changes that reality. But push back on 19 all you want. Even the generous end of the range puts him at 22. Younger than Anakin Skywalker at the Battle of Geonosis. And what Starkiller accomplished by any point in that range makes Geonosis look like a field exercise. What he did is the floor. What he never got to do is the argument. Kashyyyk in 19 BBY wasn't a quiet place. The Wookiee homeworld had been under Imperial occupation since the execution of Order 66. Its population forcibly conscripted as slave labor for Imperial construction projects across the Outer Rim. Wookiees stripped from their tree cities and put to work building the infrastructure of Palpatine's order. It was also precisely the kind of remote, brutal environment where a fugitive Jedi could disappear. Far enough from Coruscant that Imperial administrative reach was thin, populated by a species with no cultural reason to report a human family living among them. Kento Marek had been there long enough to build a life. He was a Jedi Knight who survived Order 66, not by luck, but by concealment, by choosing the farthest edge of the Outer Rim over the urban systems where Imperial attention concentrated. He had met Mali, another Jedi Knight, married her, and had a son. Force sensitivity on both sides of the bloodline, both parents carrying the connection that produced Galen. The Legends continuity treats this as foundational. Being born of 2 Jedi Knights established a force potential baseline that Galen's later feats are consistent with, a bloodline inheritance on both sides that the Legends power hierarchy takes seriously. Then, Vader landed. In 19 BBY, Vader is still in his 20s, born 41 BBY in the Legends continuity. Post-Mustafar, yes, with the cybernetics already in place, but at 22 years old rather than the 39-year-old Vader who leads the Empire's enforcement apparatus in TFU-1. The Legends continuity frames his post-Mustafar capacity as meaningfully reduced from what Anakin Skywalker would have been at full physical capability. The destroyed musculature, the restricted force flow through synthetic limbs, the suit's oxygen demands. But even reduced, he carries the highest confirmed midichlorian count in recorded Legends history, over 20,000 per cell, and he had just spent months personally executing Order 66 targets across multiple systems. Kento Marek is a Jedi Knight who has been in hiding, not combat-focused practice, for some length of time. He has a family. He is protecting a child. The engagement isn't a contest. Vader kills him. And then, in the aftermath of that, Vader notices what's watching from inside the home. A child. The force around that child registers at a level Vader doesn't walk past. He takes Galen and raises him aboard the Executor, his flagship, his personal warship, completely concealed from Palpatine. The Sith rule of two meant no sanctioned apprentice could exist. This child had to be invisible to the Emperor entirely. That concealment becomes the defining architectural constraint on every element of what follows. 17 years pass between Kashyyyk and TFU-1. The legend's sources don't provide a year-by-year account of those years, but their structural outlines are clear. Galen grows up on a warship in constant motion. No peers, no institutional training in the Force traditions that existed before him, no exposure to any world outside Vader's orbit, no Jedi archives, no Sith Academy, no contemporaries to measure himself against or learn beside. Just Vader, the missions, and the Force. The design of this training environment is where the character's structural parallels to Anakin Skywalker run into direct evidence rather than thematic resonance. The name Starkiller itself carries the connection explicitly. George Lucas's early story drafts named the Anakin analog protagonist Anakin Starkiller. Academic source material confirms the first Star Wars draft used this name for what would become the Anakin character. When the developers at LucasArts named their protagonist Starkiller, they were reaching back to that pre-production history. The arc they built reflects it. Hayden Blackman, in documented interviews, describes Starkiller starting his journey as the monster, a trained weapon beginning to question its purpose. That's Anakin's structural arc running in reverse. Anakin begins in conscience and moves toward corruption. Galen begins as darkness incarnate and discovers conscience. These are structural mirrors, and neither character follows Luke Skywalker's arc, which begins in light and simply resists corruption throughout. The Vader mirror framing isn't interpretive overlay applied after the fact. It's in the construction. Sam Witwer, who provided both voice and motion capture for Starkiller, brought the emotional interiority of that mirror into something the game's narrative alone couldn't have sustained. The character he inhabited wasn't a warrior questioning orders. He was a consciousness, raised in isolation, trained to suppress the parts of himself that questioned, beginning to realize that the system that built him was specifically engineered to prevent exactly the self-examination he was starting to engage in. That psychological architecture is Anakin's tragedy, mapped onto an inverted journey. The training program Vader designed had a specific output requirement. A hunter capable of locating Jedi Masters scattered across the Outer Rim and eliminating them without support, across varied environments, against opponents who were skilled, experienced, and fighting for survival. Everything Vader taught served that requirement. Everything that didn't serve it was left untouched. Combat application, maximized. Raw force expression, telekinesis, force lightning, physical force enhancement, the channeling and release of force energy in destructive bursts, fully developed. Emotional discipline, deliberately suppressed rather than cultivated, because the program ran on controlled aggression as fuel. Force philosophy, meditation traditions, the deeper metaphysical practice that both Jedi and Sith training at their highest levels draw on, absent. Galen's world was one axis of force mastery developed to an extraordinary level, and every other axis remained entirely unexplored. The kill missions were the practicum that verified the curriculum was working. By the time TFU-1 begins, Galen has been running operations against surviving Jedi for years. The three primary targets the game documents in sequence aren't randomly selected. Each represents a specific caliber of active Force user still operating against the Empire. Ram Koda made a command decision during the Clone Wars that, inadvertently, saved his life. He refused to use clone troopers in his unit, trusting his Force instincts over the standardized command structure the Republic provided. When Order 66 transmitted, his unit had no clones to execute it. He survived, withdrew to the Outer Rim, and built a mercenary militia that ran covert operations against Imperial infrastructure. By TFU-1, he isn't a traumatized survivor in hiding. He is an active combatant running his own campaign, a former Jedi general with years of post-Order 66 operational experience. Starkiller finds him and defeats him in combat. This isn't a training exercise against a diminished or cornered figure. Shaak Ti is a categorically different target. She sat on the Jedi High Council, one of the 12 most senior Jedi in the Order before its destruction. A Togruta master who survived the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, survived the entirety of the Clone Wars through 4 years of sustained galactic conflict, and survived Order 66 by retreating to Felucia, where she spent her remaining years actively training the native Felucians in Force traditions. The operational implication of that last detail matters. She wasn't passively hiding, she was teaching. She remained in active Force practice, building on decades of High Council level mastery, in an environment she had been living in for years and understood intimately. Starkiller finds her there and defeats her. A member of the Jedi High Council, in active practice, on home terrain. He is at most 19 or 20 years old at this point, by the most generous reading of his birth year. Maris Brood is a former Jedi consumed by the dark side under the psychological weight of isolation after Order 66, a portrait of what Galen himself might have become if the isolation had broken him rather than hardened him. Defeating her closes the pre-climax sequence. 3 Force users, 3 planetary environments, each with its own tactical context, against opponents who had decades of individual experience. This is the operational record entering the Death Star, and it represents the lower bound on what Galen Marek was already capable of. The final confrontation sequence inside the Death Star runs in 2 stages, and the first one is more analytically revealing for the ceiling argument than the second. The Vader duel is confirmed across both the game and its novelization as a Starkiller victory. Game mechanics create legitimate ambiguity about whether a player defeating the boss translates directly into lore-level power comparisons. But the novelization exists as a separate prose account that doesn't inherit those ambiguities, and the novelization confirms the defeat. That's the account the power scaling analysis uses. The significance isn't simply that Vader lost, it's who Vader was at the moment he lost it, and what that means when you place it next to the most directly comparable data point in the Legends continuity. Darth Vader in 2 BBY is 39 years old. The cybernetics have been in place for 17 years, and the Legends continuity treats his post-Mustafar capabilities as meaningfully reduced from Anakin Skywalker's unimpaired peak. Restricted force flow through synthetic limbs, the suit's oxygen demands limiting sustained force expression during extended combat. Even so, over those 17 years, he had killed Count Dooku, hunted Jedi across every sector of the galaxy, crushed multiple uprisings, and functioned as the apex enforcer of the most powerful military organization the galaxy had ever seen. He wasn't a soft target at 39. He was the reason surviving Jedi stayed hidden. Now run the Anakin comparison at the same age bracket. In 22 BBY, at Geonosis, Anakin Skywalker, the being with the highest confirmed midichlorian count in all of recorded Legends history, over 20,000 per cell, charged Count Dooku and lost his arm. Anakin was 19. The chosen one of Jedi prophecy, trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi since age 9, 10 years into formal Jedi education. He charged Dooku. Dooku took his arm. The sequence runs. Dooku defeated Anakin at 19. Anakin subsequently defeated Dooku at 22, became Darth Vader, and killed Dooku's master. Galen Marek, operating somewhere in Anakin's 19-year-old window, defeated the man who subsequently killed Dooku. Not Dooku himself, but the Force user who came after Dooku and surpassed him. That progression is direct evidence, not thematic alignment. The developmental gap between what Anakin achieved at 19 and what Starkiller achieved in the same approximate window is concrete, not interpreted. The Star Destroyer sequence requires the accurate version, not the exaggerated one, because the accurate version is more useful for the ceiling argument than the myth is. Wikipedia specifies that Starkiller telekinetically guided a damaged Star Destroyer into a controlled crash, not pulled a pristine vessel from stable orbit. A damaged ship already in motion, redirected into landing rather than uncontrolled destruction. Hayden Blackman noted in the Stinger magazine interview that the force grip on the Star Destroyer began as a design joke that evolved into a story beat, which contextualizes its original intent. The feat as it actually occurred is more measured than the common description suggests. The detail that carries analytical weight is the exertion cost. The physical and mental strain nearly caused Galen to pass out. The feat pushed him to the edge of sustainable output at that point in his development. A ceiling measurement at near incapacitation is, by definition, also a floor marker for continued development. The version of Galen Marek who has trained for 2 more decades isn't at the edge of his capacity redirecting a damaged Star Destroyer. He cleared that bar at 17 or 19. The question is where the new ceiling sits after 20 additional years of compounding growth. And that question is answered by the developmental patterns the Legends continuity applies consistently to Force users at this tier. Darth Sidious was born in 82 BBY in the Legends continuity, 2 years earlier than the Disney canon birth year of 84 BBY, a distinction that matters for maintaining accuracy in any argument built on his age. At TFU-1's 2 BBY setting, he is 80 years old. Legends reference material documents his status as Darth Plagueis' apprentice, recruited from Naboo as a young man. If that recruitment occurred at approximately 17 or 18 years of age, his formal Sith training began around 65 to 64 BBY. By 2 BBY, he had been developing and refining Force mastery for 60 to 62 years. 62 years of Sith practice against Galen Marek's 17. That developmental gap is the most important number in this entire analysis. Not because it means Starkiller lost the encounter, but because of what it implies about the trajectory that would have followed if he had lived. What Palpatine was doing with those 62 years goes substantially beyond combat application. The Legends continuity documents specific Force disciplines accumulated through sustained Sith study that exist entirely outside the combat curriculum Vader designed for Galen. Force essence preservation, the ability to project and maintain consciousness beyond physical death, which Palpatine demonstrated after the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY by transferring his essence into prepared clone bodies, a technique Legends sources associate with Sith doctrine preserved across centuries of lineage. Sith alchemy, the manipulation of the living force at a biological and material level, influencing organisms and environments in ways that standard telekinesis and force lightning don't approach. The ability to influence midichlorians at a cellular level, which Legends sources identify as the mechanism behind Darth Plagueis' mastery over life and death, a technique Plagueis developed and Palpatine learned before killing his master. Force storms, the projection of hyperspace distortion effects through focused dark side power on a scale that conventional force expression doesn't reach. Battle meditation, the ability to enhance the coordination and morale of entire fleets while simultaneously degrading the enemies. The perception and manipulation of force currents across planetary distances, drawing amplified power from dark side nexuses that Palpatine spent decades identifying and learning to utilize. None of these disciplines can be acquired through kill missions. None require physical confrontation. They require years of sustained study, access to a lineage of Sith knowledge preserved across generations, and the kind of meditative depth that develops only through deliberate practice over extended time. They are the compound interest on 62 years of Sith investment, and every one of them was in active operation when Galen Marek, 17 years into a combat-focused curriculum without philosophical depth, chose to engage their practitioner. The novelization of TFU-1 is specific about the form that engagement took. The confrontation between Marek and Palpatine wasn't a prolonged duel. Galen launched an ambush, a direct force assault, before any conventional exchange could develop. The game versions include extended battle sequences, but novelizations take precedence over gameplay in Legends power scaling discussions, and the novelization's version of this encounter is a categorically different tactical picture. Galen chose not to engage Sidious in the sustained exchange, where 62 years of compounding Sith mastery would bear down on him from every direction simultaneously. He attacked first, with maximum concentrated force output, and then absorbed the counterattack while the rebel leaders cleared the corridor. That choice is either tactical acuity or necessary pragmatism, possibly both, but either reading leads to the same conclusion. A Force user at 17 to 20 years old, 17 years into a combat curriculum deliberately designed without metaphysical depth, made the correct tactical assessment about how to engage the most powerful Sith in recorded history, executed it, and succeeded in the objective. The 3 people he protected survived. The Marek family crest became the symbol of the alliance those 3 survivors built. Now apply the maturity gap lens to what that engagement actually demonstrates. A teenager with a combat axis curriculum correctly analyzed and ambushed an 80-year-old with 62 years of cross-disciplinary Force mastery. The same Force user at 35 or 40, 2 decades further into development, with the disciplinary breadth Vader never introduced now in active practice, isn't the same Force user who needed an ambush because a sustained exchange was untenable. He has filled those gaps. The sustained exchange is no longer the losing proposition it was at 17. No official Legends sourcebook, no novelization, no developer interview assigns Galen Marek a confirmed midichlorian count. Every number in circulation in fan communities carries its own creator's explicit disclaimer. Speculation only, no official sourcing. The script won't build on a number that doesn't exist in the documented record. What the record does contain: Anakin Skywalker's count is confirmed at over 20,000 per cell in the Legends continuity, the highest on record. The Star Wars graphics reference book in the Legends continuity places Luke Skywalker's count at 14,500 per cell, roughly 72% of his father's figure. The minimum threshold for Force sensitivity sits at 7,000 per the same source. The range from minimum sensitivity to maximum known potential spans a factor of nearly 3. Midichlorian counts predict potential. Potential expresses as demonstrated capability. Demonstrated capability is what the feat record documents. A Force user at 17 to 20 who has defeated a Jedi High Council member, defeated Darth Vader per the novelization, guided a Star Destroyer at near incapacitation cost, and staged an effective Force ambush against Darth Sidious. Whatever that Force user's midichlorian count actually is, the count places them in the bracket where those feats are mechanically possible. No mid-tier count explains the outcomes. The feat record functions as the proxy for the underlying measure in the absence of the measure itself. The archivist works with what exists, not with what would make the argument more convenient. The training gaps matter as much as the confirmed feats for the ceiling projection, because they reveal how much of the disciplinary map was still unexplored at the time of Galen's death. Vader's curriculum had a specific requirement and trained toward it exclusively. Combat application, maximized across 17 years of missions. Raw Force expression, telekinesis, Force lightning, physical Force enhancement, the ability to channel and release Force energy in concentrated destructive bursts, fully developed and field-tested against active opponents. Emotional discipline, suppressed rather than cultivated, because the program ran on controlled aggression as fuel rather than on the equanimity that Jedi tradition developed or the philosophical alignment that Sith tradition built through study. Force philosophy, absent from the curriculum entirely. The meditative practices that allow Force users to access the deeper, slower currents of the living Force, not the combat applications, but the perceptual and metaphysical channels that Jedi Masters and advanced Sith practitioners spend decades opening, were never introduced. Vader himself had a decade of formal Jedi training before his Sith conversion, which means he understood Force philosophy from 2 distinct traditions, even after abandoning one. His student had neither foundation. The combat capabilities Vader developed in Galen were extraordinary. operating at a level that at 17 cleared bars Anakin Skywalker didn't clear until his early 20s. But they operated on a single axis, while the rest of the Force discipline map remained entirely untouched. This creates a specific ceiling structure that the comparison to Palpatine illuminates directly. Palpatine at 80 isn't primarily a combat axis phenomenon. The 62-year accumulation he represents runs across every Force discipline in the Sith tradition simultaneously: combat, alchemy, metaphysics, essence projection, biological manipulation, strategic Force application across distances. Galen at 17 was one instrument played at extraordinary volume. Palpatine at 80 was an entire orchestra. The gap between them at the moment of the Death Star encounter isn't primarily a raw power gap. It's a disciplinary breadth gap, and disciplinary breadth is exactly what 20 more years of survival and development would have addressed. Apply the Legends continuity's own modeling of this process. A Force user who has filled the disciplinary gaps Vader left open, who has spent 2 decades accessing the Force philosophy and meditative depth that would let them read galactic-scale Force currents rather than just combat-scale ones, who has learned the alchemy and essence techniques preserved in Sith lineage. That Force user's raw power baseline does not decrease during those 20 years. It compounds. The disciplines multiply the output of the baseline. The instrument becomes the orchestra. Anakin Skywalker was 9 when Qui-Gon Jinn recorded his midichlorian count, over 20,000 per cell, the highest ever measured, which prompted Qui-Gon to report to the Council that the Chosen One had been found on Tatooine. Formal Jedi training began that year. By his early 20s, through the Clone Wars, he was consistently described as among the most powerful Jedi alive in active operation. His developmental arc from Discovery to Clone Wars era peak spans approximately 10 years. Luke Skywalker had 0 formal Force training until age 19, when Obi-Wan Kenobi gave him his first instruction on the Millennium Falcon in transit to Alderaan. 5 years later, at 24, he had destroyed the Death Star, trained under Yoda on Dagobah, nearly held his own against Vader at Bespin, unprepared, and at 25 confronted both Vader and Palpatine at the Battle of Endor. The Legends continuity traces his development across the 40-plus years that follow, rebuilding the Jedi Order, encountering ancient Force traditions, fighting multiple galaxy-scale conflicts, ultimately described in Legends material as the most powerful Jedi in the Order's documented history, more powerful than Yoda, more powerful than Mace Windu, among the most capable Force practitioners since the Sith Wars of the Old Republic era. Time from first lesson to confronting the Emperor, 5 years. Time from that confrontation to Legends' peak capability, 4 more decades of compounding growth. Palpatine's developmental trajectory is the inverse model in one crucial way: no interruption, no Mustafar, no physical degradation point, no emotional fracture that redirected his development. 62 years of Sith mastery extending without a plateau, the compound interest accumulating uninterrupted across 6 decades. He is the argument for what Force development produces when nothing stops it. Galen Marek's observable arc, measured against both of these comparative baselines, is faster in the window we can actually document. From roughly age 5 to roughly age 17 to 20, the developmental window Anakin moved through from Discovery to Clone Wars capability. Galen went from discovered Force-sensitive child on Kashyyyk to defeated a Jedi High Council member in active combat, defeated Darth Vader per the novelization's own accounting, staged an effective Force ambush against Darth Sidious. Anakin's comparable window ends at Geonosis, where he lost his arm to Count Dooku. The developmental rate in the observable window, measured against the individual with the highest confirmed Force potential in Legends history, runs faster, not equivalent, not comparable, faster, at the same developmental stage. Take Luke's documented growth pattern, which the Legends continuity sustains across 4 decades beyond Endor, and apply it to a Force user who enters the post-Geonosis developmental window at a higher demonstrated output than Anakin occupied at that same moment. Add the disciplinary breadth that Vader deliberately withheld, now being accessed over 2 decades of sustained study. The trajectory doesn't resolve below the tier that produced Palpatine's 62-year accumulation at 80. Darth Revan provides the Legends precedent for this pattern outside the Skywalker bloodline and outside the Galactic Civil War era. Legends material set in the Old Republic traces Revan's development across decades of conflict, Force study across both light and dark traditions, and metaphysical exploration that produced capabilities exceeding any single tradition practitioner's ceiling. The Legends power hierarchy at its top tier is consistently populated by Force users who spent decades accessing disciplines their contemporaries never explored, not by Force users who maximized one axis of capability in their teens and stayed there. Galen Marek at 17 to 20 is already past the developmental markers most of those figures occupied at comparable ages. The Legends continuity's own developmental physics, applied consistently across every documented example, point in a direction the evidence doesn't leave ambiguous. A 40-year-old Galen Marek isn't a speculative construct. It's the logical output of applying confirmed developmental patterns to confirmed inputs. The inputs are documented. The patterns are documented. That the output is inference is worth stating plainly. Bounded inference, built from direct evidence, following the structure the Legends continuity applies across every Force user whose arc we can observe. But it isn't invention. The Force Unleashed 2 opens on Kamino in 1 BBY, 1 year after Galen Marek's death on the Death Star. Darth Vader has been running a cloning program. Subject 1138 is the iteration that breaks containment. He has Galen's memories. He has Galen's Force signature. He responds to names, faces, and emotional contexts from a life that, biologically speaking, he never lived. He insists, repeatedly and with conviction, that he isn't a copy. He insists he is Galen Marek. The identity question is genuinely open in the Legends continuity's own terms, and it deserves a real answer rather than a deferred one. The Force reincarnation reading has documented Legends precedents that make it mechanically plausible rather than purely speculative. Darth Sidious transferred his consciousness into prepared clone bodies after the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, a technique the Legends continuity identifies as Sith essence transfer, the projection of a Force presence into a biologically prepared vessel. Exar Kun, the ancient Sith Lord from the Old Republic era, maintained his essence in the Massassi temples on Yavin 4 for 4,000 years between his physical death and his encounter with the students of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy. Force persistence beyond physical death and consciousness projection into prepared vessels aren't peripheral phenomena in the Legends continuity. They are documented mechanisms that Sith doctrine specifically developed and preserved across centuries of lineage transmission. Subject 1138 is a biologically prepared vessel, genetically identical to Galen Marek. If any Force presence could navigate an essence transfer without deliberate Sith technique being applied from the practitioner's side, if the sheer Force magnitude released at the moment of death could approximate the mechanism, a presence at Galen's demonstrated level is among the most plausible candidates in the Legends power hierarchy. The counter-argument is equally rigorous. Sidious's essence transfers required deliberate preparation of the clone vessels, active, intentional projection of his consciousness, and years of pre-death practice with the specific technique. There is no documented mechanism by which a Force user's death, however powerful or however sudden, would replicate that process without the Sith technique being intentionally applied from their side before the moment of death. A clone carrying Galen's complete neural architecture would also carry his emotional memories, his conviction, and his subjective sense of self, which means Subject 1138's insistence that he is the original is precisely what the cloning process itself would produce, independent of any genuine continuity of consciousness. The certainty he expresses isn't evidence of identity. It's the predictable output of the architecture. Both readings hold. Neither is reckless. The Legends continuity left this open because TFU-3, the game Hayden Blackman and his team at LucasArts were actively developing, was where the question would have been resolved. TFU-3 was never made. LucasArts shut down in April 2013, a full year before the canon reclassification made the question formally moot. The development of the answer was cancelled 13 months before the continuity that would have housed it was closed. For the sealing argument, the identity question doesn't alter the calculation. Whether subject 1138 carries Galen's consciousness or simply his force architecture, the developmental potential is identical. The projected sealing belongs to whoever inhabits that pattern. On April 25, 2014, Lucasfilm issued the announcement that reorganized the franchise's publishing structure. All pre-existing expanded universe material was reclassified as Legends, separated from the new continuity the Disney-era films would build on, preserved as a distinct body of work, but formally severed from the developing story of the franchise. The decision applied universally. Every EU character, storyline, and continuity element moved to the Legends shelf simultaneously on that date. The announced rationale was creative freedom, the legitimate argument that decades of accumulated continuity create genuine constraints on new storytelling, and that reclassifying everything solved those constraints cleanly across the board. That's a real production concern. It's also why Thrawn, for instance, was subsequently brought back. Once the Legends material was separated, individual elements could be selectively reintroduced in modified forms without inheriting the full weight of EU continuity. Thrawn returned. Starkiller didn't. The distinction isn't arbitrary. The structural incompatibility with Galen Marek specifically would have existed as a production problem independent of the April 2014 decision, because the issue isn't continuity conflict, and continuity conflict is what the Legends reclassification was designed to address. Characters with continuity conflicts can be retconned, recontextualized, or modified on reintroduction. The incompatibility with Starkiller operates at a different level entirely. The sequel trilogy was built around specific Force user benchmarks that function as load-bearing elements of its narrative architecture. Darth Vader exists in the sequel trilogy's grammar as the overwhelming dark side threat of the prior era. The ceiling against which Kylo Ren's failure to equal his grandfather operates as meaningful character definition, the shadow that gives Ben Solo's fall its emotional weight. Luke Skywalker is the legend whose presence defines what the Jedi ideal looks like, and whose apparent failure becomes the central wound the sequel trilogy explores, the myth whose return the story is built around. Rey's Force development is the generational arc. Her growing capabilities are calibrated against those benchmarks in ways that define what powerful Force user means within the sequel trilogy's internal logic. Galen Marek's confirmed feat record in 2BBY already sits above Darth Vader in direct combat. This is documented in the Legends novelization, not inferred from thematic comparison, not argued from power scaling analysis, directly stated in the prose account of the TFU-1 climax. Not comparable to Vader, not challenging Vader significantly, defeating him. If Starkiller exists in the same continuity as the sequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy is built around Vader as the apex dark side benchmark that defines what Kylo Ren failed to become, then Vader as an apex benchmark stops functioning the moment Starkiller's novelization-confirmed feat record is part of the same universe. The narrative architecture the sequel trilogy requires depends on Vader occupying a specific tier. Starkiller's confirmed feats displace him from it, and there's no version of the story where that displacement doesn't produce consequences the sequel films aren't equipped to address. The projected ceiling makes this worse by an order of magnitude. A 40-year-old Galen Marek, following the developmental trajectory this analysis has built from confirmed Legends inputs, sits at or approaching the tier Palpatine occupied at 80, the tier that in the sequel trilogy's grammar represents the absolute upper ceiling of achievable Force ability. The Rise of Skywalker's central reveal carries its narrative weight precisely because Palpatine's survival represents a Force threat nothing else in the sequel trilogy's character roster can approach. His return is the event that exceeds all expectations because he was supposed to be gone, and his being gone was the condition that made the preceding 30 years of galactic history intelligible. A fully developed Galen Marek at 40 can't sit behind Luke as a figure of lesser capability. The evidence runs directly contrary to that positioning. He can't sit alongside Rey as a generational peer. the projected power differential is categorical. He can't exist quietly in the background across the 30 years between Endor and The Force Awakens, because any galactic conflict in that window would have been materially affected by a Force user at that tier, and his absence from every event in that period would require an explanation the story never provides. There is no clean insertion point. Every possible placement in the sequel trilogy's timeline produces a narrative debt the story can't repay without dismantling the architecture it was built on. This isn't grievance, it's structural engineering. The 2014 decision put an official boundary on an incompatibility that the character's own power ceiling had already made inevitable. The structural problem predated the decision and would have forced a resolution, regardless of how Lucasfilm categorized the Legends material. He is somewhere between 17 and 22 years old. The record doesn't resolve that range to a single authoritative number, and the archivist who builds on a false certainty here has already lost the argument before it starts. At whatever point in that range the Death Star corridor ends his story, he was taken from Kashyyyk at 3 or 4 years old. Raised in isolation aboard Vader's flagship, trained through 17 years of kill missions and direct Vader instruction, without access to the Force philosophy and metaphysical depth that both Jedi and Sith traditions at their highest levels draw on. By his late teens, he had the operational record of a Force user who should have been in his late 30s. 3 Jedi Masters defeated across 3 planetary environments. Darth Vader beaten in direct combat, per the novelization's own account. Darth Sidious engaged on the Death Star in a Force ambush that succeeded in its tactical objective, staged by a teenager against an 80-year-old with 62 years of compounding Sith mastery. He had not been taught Sith alchemy. He had not developed the meditative depth Palpatine spent 6 decades accumulating. He had not had 2 more decades to compound a development rate that, in the window we can actually measure, ran faster than Anakin Skywalker's comparable developmental period. The training gaps Vader deliberately left open, entire Force disciplines that had never been accessed, represented territory he had not yet entered. TFU-3 was being built. Then LucasArts closed, and the story that would have shown what Galen became was gone. The inputs that would have fed the following 2 decades of that trajectory are documented in the Legends continuity. A feat record at approximately 19 that already clears bars Anakin Skywalker didn't clear until his early 20s, operating on deliberately incomplete training. A development rate in the observable window faster than any directly comparable Force user in Legends history. A disciplinary map that was maximally developed on one axis and entirely unexplored on every other. A 62-year developmental head start that Sidious had at the moment a teenager ambushed him on the Death Star and made the correct tactical call. Apply the developmental patterns the Legends continuity uses consistently across every Force user at this tier. The trajectory points toward the ceiling that produced the most powerful Sith in Legends history. Not as speculation, as the logical output of confirmed inputs following confirmed patterns. He died at approximately 19. He wasn't close to his ceiling. If the archives are where you do your studying, subscribe. There's more here.